I thought this was a really good debate. It was favorite debate of the year so far. So, and I think it's because that each speech sort of flipped me back and forth, as well as every cross-examination about who was sort of ahead in the debate, which is sort of one of the markers of, I think, a good debate. I think that both teams would benefit from talking to the other team more, right? Like there seems to be no acknowledgement that the affirmative is talking about stuff that is deeply personal to them, but on the flip side, there's no real acknowledgement that, the negative, at least one of them, is talking about stuff that's deeply personal to him, and it's just sort of like, okay, you just both sort of go into debate modes in terms of like, we'll win indigenous over blindness, I'll win blindness over an indigenous, and now let's have a debate over there. And yeah, both sides are talking about how we sort of help the other side, but like, I mean, there's a person there who's saying like, this offends me, and opposed to being like, oh, I'm sorry, my culture feels about it differently, is just sort of like, the debate argument is going to be like my culture needs to be it, right? And it's not that you do a bad job in that argument, but it's just sort of like acknowledge that. And at the same point, they're saying that our culture understands that term differently, and then opposed to sort of like being like, let's reflect on it, it's like, this is how it always is, right? And so it's just sort of like an acknowledgement and appreciation, because, I mean, y'all were doing very powerful stuff. So sort of acknowledging that, is sort of, I think goes a long way performatively and helpfully and stuff like that. So I end up voting affirmative, and the reason why I end up voting affirmative is that the 2-R, and you should watch this video afterwards, is like the question that's foregrounded at the front right in front of them is like, what happens for indigenous survival in this round? Your talk in the 2-R about what happens is isolated to only a couple of split seconds where you're like, well, we could help make sure that that's accessible. If you listen to the 2-R, there's not a talk about what the affirmative is doing or much talk about indigenous in general. And in cross-examination, you start talking about like the way that, this station, I mean, she cuts you off, but there's some station that, was helped to make accessible where indigenous were able to give access to it, where disability was able to actually help indigenous access to it. But then you talk about how debate is inaccessible because there's not, all different forms of technology missing. You don't then talk about the indigenous accessibility issues, just becomes then accessibility holistically, right? And so I think that if you're not giving a counter role of the ballot and that you're pitching it on that, you'll capture their role of the ballot, you need to really talk about that question given what the role of the ballot is in this round. And I think that you could do that. I think you just don't do that, in the block or in the 2-R. And I think that that's the part. Like you should be able to, I should be able to listen to the 2-R and know what the affirmative is doing. And all I know is that they said, blind spot and, not that additional form of interaction. The argument that I end up voting on specifically is the question of language, and I think that the 2-R gets to it later in the debate, and I think that when you start talking language at the top, you didn't say enough for me, but when you got to the bottom, you talked about the way that not being able to utilize certain terms that are important to you is a form of genocide within this room. That's hinted at the top of the speech, but to me that's really the sole piece of offense you've got going versus like, a generic disability studies always push themselves on, indigenous scholars, because again, you're talking about what's happening in this room. How is he doing in this room? And the question and the instance that you talk about later is when he says that blindness must always be, this more of a literal form of blindness. And so the way you say it always must be a metaphor, right? Which means that the way that language operates that you're talking about is being genocidal. So that way, culture of it spoken is one of the ways it takes place. And so that's important in the way she's talking about genocide of indigenous people, and, the two of them and their ancestors come from the fact that languages have been exterminated, that they weren't able to speak certain ways. And when they talk about invite us into the house and then you complain that the problems are still the same, is that English has been forced upon them as a language, and then those meanings are then being criticized. And I think that in cross-examination, you make the what language are we speaking argument, and I think you should go back to it. I don't think they need to win it, because I think it's an example of where they say that the imposition of a set form of what blind means as form of being Western is genocide, so that then becomes that indigenous genocide that then takes place in the context of the round, because there's a refusal to allow that form of acknowledgement. Now, I think that if you go for some of your social death arguments where you talk about the way that we're all dead in that 2-R, I think you potentially get some traction about like this is genocide, right? There's then a criticism of this being genocide, but if the removal and the prevention of language is genocide and you're not going for those arguments anymore, the attempt to say indigenous people can't speak in a language that they say they speak from is then that's the genocidal act, which then has that sort of impact and exclusion. And you're not saying that the role of the ballot is to create a space for debate to be accessible for all people first and foremost, and then indigenous, right? You don't do you have starting point, but you don't give a counter. You don't have a role of ballot. You just counter that. So like if you did that disability being that's the role of the ballot, and then there could be a bigger debate over the role of ballot, but you sort of concede that point. So I think that that's one of the other ways that you could gain access to it, or go for the spectrality argument. And so I think that those are ways to be able to do that. And so again, the language I put to the forefront, I do, and against discourse critiques in general, I actually think that's an incredible argument, that you've been forced to learn English, and then they criticize you for your use of English because you're trying to connect these English terms to spiritual terms or terms in the past and history. And like, I mean, literally, the re-education campaigns, natives not being able to talk about their words and their languages, kids stolen, put into schools, and then beaten for not, using their indigenous languages. Like, all of those things are very literal. And so when it happens in a discourse, in the context of the debate round, I think that your genocide arguments work really well with that. And I think that you should get the, what language are we speaking that you didn't cross-ex? I'd make that in the speech proper, because I think that makes that argument even then more explicit, right? Because then you could be like, we're foreigners in this language. Our languages are not this language, but we have to speak within it, within debate, for people to vote within it, right? Because the majority of judges are English only or English and Spanish, certainly not English in the many indigenous languages that exist. So there has to be sort of a language for us to communicate in, but then for you two to be criticized for sort of using words that other people find offensive. But this is where it's like when you do something that someone find offensive in a context like this round, the apology could sort of go a long way, and then you could get into the meaning for yourself, right? Opposed to some rounds when they do, like, you use the word America, and this means, other discourse where it isn't personal, I don't think that apology is necessary because it's not a personal issue. But when it is a issue about like social location, then I think that sort of acknowledgement could help out. I would say. The other thing is that I think that the 2AC has severe undercoverage on the anthro-criticism. I don't know how much you do judge philosophy or whatnot, but like my judge philosophy rants about it for a while about speciesism. So it's like with your judge, it's probably like, time allocation wise, to me that seemed like that would be the highlighted position to get to with more time. And the other thing is that when you get there, you still just say land, trees, stuff like that. You don't talk even about, the animals or the spirits of the animal. When you see, the squirrel running or the deer running, that embodies your ancestors. All your examples are just like the trees and stuff like that, which is not necessarily the same thing as like speciesism, sociodeep ecology. So if you shift that language to talking about the spirits of animal objects opposed to like, nature objects, then that, or subjects rather, would be better for both of that. Then that would be, at least then show how the indigenous knowledge systems gains traction against speciesism things opposed to just sort of being ecological things. And so like, just nuance that language a little bit more, but I'd spend some more time for it. And Gregor Walbring, Wolbring, he writes on disability studies and the intersection of critical animal rights. Oh, you already know? Okay, all right, yeah. I do a lot of work with him. So he writes lots of good stuff. And like, so you could really have a position if you do them both regularly, an alternative that readily solves for both of those within his literature basis. And if you ever go against a speciesism kit when you're doing your animal stuff, he's got great stuff to answer, species and stuff like that as well. So that's the substance of the disclosure. Other questions?
Yeah, I just have a question about I've traditionally only gone for intro against kind of more policy oriented teams. So just in terms of like future times when I go for this argument, what are some like suggestions or?
I think you just focus on identity. You don't go back to the original speech or the evidence they're reading. Like that Rodriguez evidence has like other metaphors that they use that you could point out that's being speciest within there. And so pulling out some of those specific links would be better. Otherwise, it's just like they have an identity politics focus. And when they're like, you just pigeonhole us into identity debates, right? You haven't given the nuance for why their identity debate is different.
Right.
So I think that doing that, that would be one thing that would be a lot better. And there is people out there that do just say indigenous cultures, while they attempt to be spiritual with animals, that indigenous cultures oftentimes turn them into objects to also be utilized and used in things like that. Now, there's a problem, right? If you get up here and you're reading indigenous cultures do this, and the two of you are indigenous, and they're gonna be like, "What the fuck? You can't tell me what my culture does," right? But there's differences between different indigenous populations that exist. So, like, I'm sure the evidence doesn't indict the whole of Native peoples, so, right? So yeah. Any other substance questions or?
I don't know. Like the whole debate, I felt funky.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if that makes sense, but like in the 2AC and just, I don't know, like I feel like I just wasn't, like all of like what I was trying to say wasn't connecting right in this round. I don't know, like my 2AC, like do you think I know you think I should have allocated more time to Anthro, but do you think I was like being redundant or something I didn't need to say? I don't know.
I didn't think you were redundant. I think you have a tethering point of offense. Like after the 2AC, there was arguments you could win on each flow, but there wasn't necessarily like a holistic like we win the round. I mean, obviously the role of the ballot this round's about, but there wasn't like a tethering principle for how the ways in which everything relate back to that. It sort of seemed like there was some disconnected offense on each of the flows, as opposed to a tethering offensive principle to sort of you had the round framing, but you weren't necessarily connecting back to the round framing in each instance. Right, so it's like, so for instance, if that language thing that you do at the bottom of the 2NR is explained in the 2AC when you make that language argument, then you immediately go to how that connects to the roll of ballot, opposed to sort of waiting to the end or like later speeches. That could be a way of increasing the 2AC strength.
What did you think about the 1AR? Like, how can
The 1AR did not and I guess that's a good question, because the 1AR didn't answer a lot of the evidence that they're reading, and so that evidence could trip you up. You're very good at explaining your story and your arguments, and you carry through the arguments that need to be won in the 2AR. But I think that there could be more specific answers to the evidence that they're reading, and that's something that the 2A could do for the 1AR, is that you can pull out specific indicts or quotes from their evidence that sound anti-indigenous or show that they have a universal fixed form of language that is Western, right? You usually assert that throughout the debate, but you could probably point to quotes within their evidence to do that.
Okay.
Right, and so that matters a lot more if there's a competing role of the ballot that exists in the round, or stuff like that.
Yeah, because I really thought that they were going to go for Anthro, because I felt like I really undercovered it in the 2AC. I spent like a minute on it.
Yeah.
I thought they were going to
A
go
little
for
more.
Anthro.
I
He
thought
spent
so.
like 6 minutes on it. So then I wanted him to spend at least like 3 minutes on it. Do you think he was making the right arguments if they had?
Yeah, no, definitely, because I thought they were going to go for Anthro after that. I was like, well, it seems like I'm going to vote for Anthro in this round at that point. I thought it was, because it wasn't even like that great offense, and then the 2AR, the 1NR did more than sufficient work on the arguments you had, and like maybe a little bit more of hold them to just these three arguments, right? A little bit more protection, shutting the door, making sure, check the other flows for things that might be cross-applied stuff, like, because remember that roll of ballot, indigenous, right? If that's not at the center points or a competing roll of the ballot, you don't get traction, right? So that's what's there. But then I think that the 1AR's coverage on that was good to make it where it's like the 2NR would have to give it a battle. I do applaud you going for ableism.
What's the at what point specifically for after during the explanation of the anthro, was there any specific argument I could have covered more or framed better?
You after the 2AC, you really needed to sell the indigenous. When we say indigenous, when we say ancestors, we mean the animals too. And again, you were like trees, land, land, right? And it's like, obviously your people ancestors hunted animals. That does not necessarily mean they were species, because it's done in a different way that animal hunting takes place now. But if you don't even give a nod to the animals, then it seems like you're just the pig is exactly the same as the tree, which necessarily isn't offensive if the tree is the same as a human, but you're not necessarily doing that additional connection and things like that. So that would be what you really need to sell. Because that's the only argument that the 2IC gives you to really go for. Permutations also would not be a bad situation as well.
Okay.
On any of these arguments, right? Because then, that's sort of do our advocacy, we won't say blind. And now they have to explain why you should be stuck to what you said in the 1IC.
Yeah. I don't know how I feel about permutations.
Yeah, that's fair. Some people don't like them now as much, but it's you should at least make it's not a reason to reject us argument. At worst, right, these are reasons that the movement could get better. Is not a reason to reject us holistically type thing, something like that. So, yeah. So the last thing is that because you ran Anthro, when it's relevant to the decision, I offer a veg pledge within my judging paradigm, where it's anyone who commits to it's just eating vegetarian at the tournament, meals provided, so it's not when you have to spend your own money. I add an extra speaker point over what I've sort of already assigned you, which I need your names because I signed it and then did not pick the correct name. I didn't know who's who, but
He's Joe. And he's one. Yeah.
okay, great. And so because that's sort of like the social location that I come from in terms of like activating agency, and it seems like it's also connected to the ways at which you're all speaking about it. They're your ancestors, and they're the way in which that disability is framed and things like that. But if you don't want to, it doesn't change anything. So it's up to
Do it.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Okay.
How do we do it?
You just tell me, and then it's really like, you give an honest commitment to doing it at tournament provided meals. So like, today when they have the meat sandwiches or the vegetarian sandwiches, you take the vegetarian sandwiches, right? I'm obviously not going to follow you throughout all tournaments, but it's like the goal. So you commit for, the duration of the season, and give it, honest effort and see what it's like. So,
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, sure.
okay. Right. Great. Thanks for a very good debate. I definitely really enjoyed it.
Thanks.